Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to continue our journey to Endgame with part 11 and take a look at the second Captain America film, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Now this film sees returning stars from the previous films, such as Chris Evans. Scarlett Johansson comes back as Black Widow, as well as Nick Fury, played by Sam Jackson, and Mariah Hill, played by Kobe Smulders. We also do get a few new characters that show up. Anthony Mackie playing the Falcon. Bucky Barnes now, or Sebastian Stan, who's playing Bucky Barnes slash the Winter Soldier. And We have Robert Redford coming to play Director Pierce. So we have a pretty good cast in this one around, and this is also the first film in the MCU that was directed by the Russo brothers, who would go on to do Captain America: Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. This was kind of our first taste of them, and boy, this was a fun outing. This was a fun movie to watch, and it was entertaining and it was gripping, and you kind of forget that. Um, I had kind of forgotten how much I liked this movie until I rewatched it, and it was just a whole new thing where you're watching this movie, and it's so drastically different, tonally from the first Captain America, where the first Captain America kind of had that campy feel to it, and this is almost like a political thriller, and it works very well. It's very different from a traditional superhero movie formula in many ways. But let's dive into the film. So essentially, the first almost 15 minutes are actually reestablishing Steve Rogers and the world and introducing a few new characters. The first scene we get is Steve Rogers running around the reflecting pool in Washington D.C., and he is running past Anthony Mackie, who is also doing the same thing. And Anthony Mackie plays Falcon, or Sam Wilson, also known as the Falcon. Um, but we don't know that yet in the film. They're just kind of buddies. They're talking to each other, and everybody kind of knows who Captain America is. This isn't necessarily a universe where everybody wears a mask and nobody knows who anybody is. For the most part, I mean, there are still some like Spider-Man and stuff like that people don't know who they are. But for the most part, people know who the Avengers are in a lot of cases. And Captain America is very high profile. You have this opening scene, and then you have at the end of it, you have Black Widow come and pick up Captain America in this shiny new muscle car. And I'll kind of get to that. This is kind of one of the very small complaints I have about this film, is kind of the interactions between Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff. And just because it's a bit misleading, and they're not bad, it's just because it's a bit misleading, because Black Widow is a major part of this movie, as is Nick Fury. So the next scene we see has them doing an operation where we basically see that Captain America has gone and started working for Shield, and he's doing this operation where they have to take over this boat. And there's a lot of really good fight scenes. The hand-to-hand fighting in this movie is really really good. The Russos are really, really good at directing that type of thing. You saw it in Civil War as well, especially with that end scene where you have Cap and Bucky versus Iron Man. But in this movie, it's really, really good. The choreography is amazing. Um, and even when it's Cap versus like regular guys, they do it really, really well, and they showcase his kind of superhero uh, strength and speed compared to normal people, where he's just ragdolling people, and it looks amazing. Um, Moving past that, basically, this is where we kind of start developing trust issues with Captain America, where back in World War II, he completely trusted in the government, he completely trusted in his superiors, and it was a bit more of a younger, maybe more naive Steve Rogers, where now he's dead center in the intelligence community, and he's doing these black operations for Shield, and he's finding out that basically, people on his team have different objectives than what his objective is. Where Natasha is trying to get Shield data off the boat, and Steve is trying to save hostages. And again, it kind of conflicts with Steve Rogers' own personal views on things, where he is really only he's more or less out to help people and make a difference, whereas Shield is more in dealing with what they perceive to be the greater good. And some other stuff about that comes up after the fact, but this is where we start to see it, and it kind of builds throughout the first act of the film, where he confronts Nick Fury, and again, this is where the Captain Marvel thing kind of screws everything up, where the cat scratches his eye out and stuff, and he has this little speech with Steve Rogers, and one of the points he makes is the last time I trusted somebody, I lost an eye, and it makes it so much less impactful when you realize that he lost the eye to a cat. um, and yeah, again, it retrospectively it ruins that scene, uh, or at least that part of that scene. But basically, Nick Fury shows Captain America what they've been working on, and again, you have this conflict with Captain America where he's saying that Nick Fury has the whole idea that the idea is to stop threats before they happen, and Captain America's whole thing is that if you try to stop a war before it starts, innocent people die. And he's right in the end. Captain America is right, but you can also see the reasoning for Nick Fury, where he wants to get ahead of the game because of the shit that happened in New York, and you know that's what's on his mind, and that's why he's building these three helicarriers that are all connected, and they're all supposed to be triangulating things. Um, but moving on from that, we kind of get a few little glimpses of some other stuff with Captain America, where we show that he goes back to his apartment. He's getting like he's trying to catch up with the 70 years that he's lost, and it's also kind of a sad existence because they have this very gut wrenching scene with Peggy Carter, who's now very old. After Steve Rogers goes and secretly sees an exhibit of himself at the Smithsonian, and she's very old, and he's visiting her. She's in a nursing home pretty much, um, and he's having this conversation with her, and she's saying stuff to him, and you feel like it's a really normal conversation. And then she starts to cough, so he goes and gets her some water. And when he comes back, she has this moment like, "Oh my God, you're alive, and you're here." And you realize that she has some kind of disease, whether it's dementia or Alzheimer's, and it's one of those gut wrenching things. Like he never got to live it, and she even says this, that he never got to live his life, um, and now that he's in the future, he kind of has to start over, which is painful when you think about it. You think about a world where you were displaced. You went in, it's kind of like if you took Futurama, the idea of that seriously, where you've gone so far into the future that everybody you knew or loved is dead. Everybody you ever had a connection with no longer exists, or they're so old that they don't even remember you. And it's painful in a way to see that in a film, because it humanizes Captain America in a lot of ways, where he looks, the way that he acts and the way that he presents himself. He presents himself almost like this, epitome of almost like a Boy Scout. He tries to be perfect in every way, but you see that there's all of this pain that's kind of behind that, and it humanizes him in a very real way, and makes him a lot more of a three-dimensional character than what he was in the first Captain America film. Where in that film he was kind of just your true blue hero type. Now he's becoming more jaded, and that's also reflected in the costume design as well. Where his costume is much darker in this than it was even in Avengers. Um, but moving on from that, there's a whole bunch of kind of build up scenes between Black Widow and Captain America and Nick Fury, and there's a bunch of scenes. They introduce Robert Redford's character, who's essentially the director of Shield. Um, I think a councilman, I believe, is the term they use, Councilman Pierce. And Robert Redford does a very good job in this movie. I loved his character, and I was really surprised. I remember at the time that he was doing a Marvel movie, because it was kind of at that time where you didn't have a lot of like high level actors. You had like Sam Jackson, but most of the other people were kind of like low level, or people that had been in stuff but weren't considered A-listers. This is before they got like Michael Douglas to be in Ant-Man, and a bunch of other stuff. But it was interesting to see a very distinguished actor playing in a Marvel film, because it does elevate the film a lot. Um, but moving on from that, we kind of get the idea. Uh, we were planted the seeds of doubt very early, especially with Steve Rogers, and then that kind of carries over into other characters. Natasha Romanoff gets that as well eventually, and Nick Fury gets that when he finds out that somebody has been messing with his clearances. Now, this then leads into what is essentially the driving point in the film. Because up until this point, Steve Rogers is he's going along with the program. He doesn't necessarily like all of it, but he's going along with it. And the next scene is Nick Fury basically getting almost murdered by a bunch of fake cops who are a bunch of guys that are masquerading as cops, and he barely manages to escape with his life to make it back to Steve Rogers' apartment. So uh, then he basically has enough time to tell Steve Rogers that there's Shield's compromised and there's something wrong. Don't trust anyone before he is then shot. And we don't necessarily know who the shooter is at this point because everybody's been shooting at Nick Fury for the last like 10 minutes. But Steve Rogers manages to chase the assailant down, and he comes into contact with him. And this is our first glimpse of the Winter Soldier. Now he's wearing a full face mask during the scene, so you really don't know who it is. Sebastian Stan is the character, is the actor that plays him, and if anybody knows the comic books, you know who the Winter Soldier is, and why he does what he does. But at this point, Captain America is completely in the dark, and the face mask. It's not like something stupid. It's not like a domino mask that doesn't make any sense. It's a full face mask that covers up basically everything but his forehead and his hair. So it's plausible that Steve does not know who he is. Um, and then afterwards, we learn basically Natasha sheds some light on who he is, the Winter Soldier. He's a Black Ops ghost tail. She met him. She basically came in contact with him once, and he shot through her to kill his target. Um, but this is the point where we get the world turns on Steve Rogers, and we get a couple of really really great scenes. There's a scene between Chris Evans' Steve Rogers and Pierce, where they're talking about Nick Fury, and basically Pierce knows that Captain America knows something, but he's not spilling it because Nick Fury told him don't trust anybody. So he walks out, but there's this really great scene. He gets in this elevator, and there's these other guys from his strike team that kind of get in, and there's a few other people. And as the elevator keeps going down, more and more guys get into it. Um, and also, just as a side note, we also get introduced to Brock Rumlow in this, who would become the villain Crossbones. And we do see him at the beginning of Captain America Civil War as well, and we see kind of how he becomes Crossbones in this. But all of those guys are in the elevator, and Captain America has this great scene where he's looking at these guys, and he sees a bead of sweat go down a guy's face, and another one he sees a guy holding his hand on his little stun weapon that he has, and we know exactly what's about to happen in this elevator. And Steve Rogers has this great line where he just goes, "If anybody wants to step out now, if anybody wants to step out, now would be a good time." And everybody just stays in the elevator, and he proceeds to beat the living shit out of all of them and manages to escape. And it's a really, really well done action scene. That's the thing. This movie has great action in it, and it really does showcase Captain America's powers. Not so much, it takes it to almost another level where he's doing stuff that we haven't really seen him do in a setting before. Where we saw some stuff in Avengers, and we saw stuff in obviously the original Captain America film, but this has him like falling from buildings and shit and stuff like that. It's really really good. So he escapes. He gets in contact with Natasha. They basically go on the run because they all know exactly what's happening now. And Nick Fury gave Steve Rogers this little thumb drive. So the thumb drive is now the MacGuffin. They need to find out what the hell's going on. So basically, it's follow the Nick Fury's trail of breadcrumbs for the next 20 or 30 minutes of the film, which honestly, it's really, really good. The tension is great. They do a very good job at acting out the scenes. And the only kind of problem, again, I have with this is like this movie, and it's kind of just something that's undone in Age of Ultron, which is the movie that follows this, is they kind of build up this relationship between Natasha and Steve, and I know in I think the Ultimate Universe they dated for a while or something like that. One of the Marvel universes, they had a thing, but they kind of build it up in this as like, oh, it's supposed to be, I can trust you, I can trust you. That's the whole idea. but they build up this almost romantic tension between the two of them, and it's never actually released. They kind of like shoehorn in this other character, which again I kind of find kind of stupid, and I'll explain that later. That's really the only thing I take points away for this film. um, and not just because he doesn't you know get with Black Widow. It's just this other woman who's in this is just kind of like, all right, she's there. It's not really anything too insane. But so back to the plot. They track this. There's this actually this really nice scene where they track this. They go back to this place in New Jersey where is actually the training ground where Steve was in World War II, and they have this redoing of this scene where Steve's looking at this flagpole, and it's the scene from the first Captain America where he finds the flagpole. He's running laps, and the drill instructor's screaming at him to keep going and going and going, and it's a really nice homage to that, where he's just kind of remembering stuff from the past, because again, this is a man who's literally removed from time. He hasn't had the chance to experience the decades as they've rolled by. He has literally just been pulled out of one and placed in another. So it's kind of, he's nostalgic almost. He gets caught in this moment of nostalgia, and we'll see that again later on. But he goes and they find this bunker, and they happen to find apparently Arnim Zola, the Nazi scientist, or the Hydra scientist from the first film, the little guy who had all the designs for the Tesseract weapons, is alive and well and inside of a living computer. And this is kind of like a homage to the comic books, where he has like an android body and like a television for a gut. It's kind of strange, but essentially they have this little, they get a little bit of information from him about what's going on, and about the Winter Soldier, and about the history of Hydra. And this is basically kind of like the exposition dump of the film, but it's not terribly boring, because it has a twist to it, where we find out that Hydra has actually been growing inside of Shield since the end of World War II, and they've been slowly trying to shape world events, because they realized that you couldn't change the world by force; you had to change it subtly over time. In order to control the populace, which is a brilliant angle to take with this film, and to reintroduce Hydra back into the MCU from the World War II days. Um, but they introduced some other characters too. There's a lot of Shield agents that are involved in Hydra now, and all the ones that are hunting them essentially. And there's a lot. They find out that Pierce is involved in it. Fury apparently had no idea. He was essentially a puppet. But and also, by the way, after Fury's little shootout in Steve Rogers' apartment, he was pronounced dead. So everybody basically thinks that he's dead at this point. Um, so after a bomb gets dropped on Steve and Natasha, they barely manage to escape, and they make it back to Washington, where they bunk up with Sam Wilson, who is the only person that Steve can trust. Now, this is again where we find out that Sam Wilson wasn't so much, he alludes to being a pilot, essentially, or what Steve thinks is a pilot. In reality, he flies this experimental flight suit that gives him wings, hence the Falcon. Um, so after procuring this, they get information out of a Shield operative, who's kind of, he pops up a few times in the film. He's on the boat as a hostage at the beginning, and then he works with Pierce in the middle part of it, and then he pops up here, and he basically drops the bomb on them, that the helicarrier system, once it goes up, is going to eliminate all possible threats to Hydra, which is going to be roughly 20 million people. Um, and this is going to wind up being this is basically Arnim Zola's master plan that is now going to be put into motion. So our heroes now have essentially they have a point now where they have to disable the helicarriers before they can launch, and this leads us into the final confrontation, where before that you have a situation where basically the Winter Soldier shows up and screws everything over. And Steve and the Winter Soldier have basically it boils down to them having a fist fight. Steve has his shield and the Winter Soldier has his metal arm. And this is when we find out that the Winter Soldier is actually Bucky. And it's this moment where Bucky essentially has amnesia. He can't remember anything about his past because he's had his brain wiped by the various governments that have used him over the years. And it's also hinted at in this film that he is responsible for Howard Stark's death, which is confirmed later on in Captain America: Civil War. But it's kind of like a minor plot point. You can see it if you watch some of the stuff. And this is kind of the turning point for Steve, where like now he realizes that his best friend is alive, even though he's a brainwashed assassin. He's alive. Um, and this leads us again into situations where we find out that, again, I'm not going to give away all of it. It's a bit to explain, but essentially they find out that Nick Fury is alive. He survived the gunshots. He faked his death in order to sneak out so that they wouldn't try to kill him in his hospital bed. And this has then directly leads into what will be their final assault on the Shield facility in Washington D.C. And this final battle does a very, very good job at setting itself up and giving you. It doesn't end itself too quickly. It has good pacing, which is something that Marvel has struggled with at times, is the pacing. But the pacing in this is very, very good. Where you have Steve Rogers and Falcon are each, they have to change the a little circuit board inside of the helicarrier to change it so that it won't start killing people. And all the stuff about that, and they get two of them done at the same time. Black Widow and Nick Fury take over the office where all the Shield guys are, and the High Council and everything, which were in black essentially. In Avengers, you kind of saw them, but in this they're alive and they're there. And so it's kind of like a turn on turn thing where you find out that essentially Pierce was going to kill them all anyway, and he was going to. He had these. Apparently, they're like little shield emblems, pins they had on their clothes are actually thermite that will burn through their chest, and he kills a few of them with it, except for Natasha for some weird reason. Um, but the lead up, what's going to happen. Pierce has the Winter Soldier because of an earlier scene where he's conversing with him, and then another scene not too long after that where they're wiping Winter Soldier's brain. But Winter Soldier remembers Steve Rogers to an extent. His memories are coming back, and that's kind of what is happening at the end fight, where Winter Soldier doesn't know what he's doing anymore because all of these old memories from when he was younger are coming back. Um, Now there is one scene in this that I kind of think is stupid in retrospect for people that like weren't following the film. Is there's a scene where Robert Redford's character is sitting down with Sebastian Stan, Winter Soldier, and his Stan's face is supposed to be in the dark. His shadows, all you can see over his eyes, but in the scene, the lighting is good enough where you can actually see his entire face. So the element of mystique is gone there. They should have darkened those shadows a lot more, or they should have done something else, or they should have just had him wear the mask. And I think it would have worked a lot better. But there was some issues with that scene. But again, aside from that, moving forward, again, the final battle. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but that final battle where you have the last showdown, Falcon gets taken out. He's out of the fight. He's alive, but he's out of the fight. And Pierce eventually gets taken out by Nick Fury. Um, but you have that final showdown between Captain America and Bucky, and it's so because the stipulations of what's going on at this point. If you've seen the first Captain America and you've watched this movie all the way through, is the first line that comes from Steve is probably the best line, where he says, "I don't make me do this," because he doesn't want to hurt his friend. And even though the fight is essentially almost an even match, it's you don't really get the feeling until the end that Steve Rogers is holding back. But he knows that if he doesn't stop Bucky, if he doesn't get past him, then he can't stop. Then he can't stop what's going to happen, and a bunch of innocent people are going to die. And ultimately, that weighs more on him than the life of his friend, even though he doesn't actually kill Bucky. But the fight itself, I mean, it's not, up until this point, Captain America's been essentially bulletproof through this entire movie for the most part. I mean, he survives a missile strike on a bunker. He's been essentially bulletproof. But in this fight, he gets messed up. He gets shot like 3 or 4 times. He gets the living crap beaten out of him. He gets punched in the face until he's essentially unconscious. So, again, the brutality of it, it's again, it's some of the most brutal hand-to-hand combat I've ever seen in a Marvel film. And, again, both of the characters are all bloodied up by the end of it. It's nothing to shake a head at, but the end of it kind of gives you hope where they fall into the water below where the carrier is, the helicarrier, and Winter Soldier saves Steve as he's sinking down into the water. And again, it's kind of a callback almost to the first Captain America when he crashes the plane, where he's just kind of sinking down into the abyss again, and he's essentially almost given up. And Winter Soldier pulls him out and drags him back up onto shore, and leaves him there. But this winds up, essentially this winds up doing two things. Number one, this destroys Shield, which is a repercussion that is felt in later films, even though Shield is kind of reestablished. And then it also sends Steve Rogers and Natasha basically to the Avengers full time, where Steve Rogers is essentially running the team, as opposed to he's running the facility now. He's running he's fully into it as opposed to Shield, because now Shield's gone. The only people he has left are the Avengers. So him and Natasha go off for that. Nick Fury says he's going off to Europe essentially to clean up any of the Hydra, any of the uh, you know remnants of Hydra that are left. And Sam Wilson, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Natasha's going to the Avengers. Steve Rogers and Sam Wilson are going to go find Winter Soldier, which leads into Captain America: Civil War. So, everybody kind of goes their separate ways, but there's been a lot of character growth. We've had some new introductions, and again, going back, this film does a lot of things really, really well, and it really it brings the Captain America character forward and develops his character so much over the course of this film, where he's no longer kind of that. Even though I really love Captain America: The First Avenger, this makes his character so much more three-dimensional, and it adds to the Bucky character. You bring in Sam Wilson, you learn about him. It adds to the Natasha character. It adds to Nick Fury. Everybody that was in this movie had some kind of a growth arc, and that's very hard to do in films. And that's why I love what the Russos do in their MCU films. And they carry that forward with Civil War. They carry that forward with Infinity War, and I'm sure they'll do it again with Endgame. But again, this is an amazing movie. But if I were to give it a rating, I would have to give it 8.3 Captain America Shield Frisbee tosses out of 10. Now that we're done with that, we are going to be moving into the next Avengers film, which was directed by Joss Whedon and reunited the original team, along with adding Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, and Vision, and introducing the villain Ultron with Avengers: Age of Ultron from 2015. So we will see you again then. Uh, so again, thank you for watching. Leave anything you have to say in the comments. Put a like on the video. Subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications. And remember, I live my life free of compromise.